Welcome and thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world at different times of day. Really appreciate that you're taking these 1.5 hours out of your day to join us. We've got a really exciting agenda coming up, and let me just quickly share my screen so that you can see what I'll be talking about. I'll just be giving a very brief introduction to what we'll be doing here today. So as I said, welcome to this webinar on towards just environmental futures, exploring the equity dimensions of nature-based solutions in cities. This is a project or an initiative that is funded by the Urban Studies Foundation. And essentially, the question at the heart of this seminar series is, what role can nature-based solutions play in remediating urban inequality and creating more just, equitable, and environmentally sustainable urban futures? So that is really what we're all about. And this is an initiative that is being led by Kate Derrickson, as was myself. Kate is an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society at the University of Minnesota, as well as the co-director of the CREATE project, which is one of the University of Minnesota's Grand Challenge initiatives. And I am a researcher at the Center for Sustainability Transitions here at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And we thought of this seminar series as an interdisciplinary exploration. So we wanted to get as many people involved from a wide variety of research fields to really kind of explore this question and really explore across disciplines how, you know, different fields of study actually deal with, address, challenge, the issue of inequality or equity in the context of nature-based solutions in cities. And the ultimate goal of this seminar series is actually a collection of papers as a special issue in the journal Urban Studies. And so without further ado, I want to introduce our lovely lineup of speakers today. I'm going to follow the order that you see on the screen. So we've got Bonnie Keeler, who is an associate professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, as well as also a co-director of the CREATE initiative, like Kate. And Bonnie has a wide variety of expertise in urban ecosystem services and issues around green gentrification, among other things. She'll tell you all about that. Pipin Anderson is an associate professor at the Department of Environmental and Geographical Sciences here at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And Pipin is an expert in urban ecology, especially in highly biodiverse global South contexts. And then next is Olumuyiwa Olujimi, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Architecture at the Federal University of Technology, Akure in Nigeria. And Olumuyiwa has expertise at the nexus of informal settlements and green infrastructure, especially. And so he'll be talking a little bit to that in a minute. And then we have Lin Jin, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Architecture and Built Environment at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo in China. And Lin Jin is an assistant professor in sustainable urbanism and has expertise in urban governance and sustainability transitions. And then we have Seema Mundoli, who is an assistant professor at the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability at Azim Premji University in India. And Seema has strong interest in environmental history, urban sustainability in the global South, and science communication. And finally, last but not least, we've got Austin Matheny, who is a doctoral candidate at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, Spain. And Austin has an interest in urban environmental justice through the sort of lens of Southern urbanisms. And his PhD work is centered on Nairobi. So that is just a very brief overview, but we will shortly hear more from all of these speakers, because how this is going to work from now on is that there's going to be 2 rounds of speed talks. So the speed talks are 5 minutes each. So the speakers have only got 5 minutes to introduce themselves, their work, and speak to this question that I posed at the beginning. And we will have 3 speakers go one after the other, and then we'll have a short round, 5 minutes or so, if there are any clarifying questions. And then we'll have the second round again, followed by a short, pause for clarifying questions. But if you, as the audience, have anything beyond a clarifying question, please make a note of it, and we'll come back to that after the speed talks, because after the speed talks, we go into a panel discussion, which which Kate will lead, and in the sort of second half of that discussion, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So please, if you just have some clarifying quick questions up front, you can pose them either in the chat or in the Q&A function of this webinar. And if you have some bigger questions or reflections, or you want to, make a response to something that's been said, also in the panel discussion, we'll come to that point in the webinar towards the end. And then you can also raise your hand if you want to actually, if you want me to unmute you, and you can actually say your question, or otherwise just use the chat function or the Q&A function. I think that's probably it from me at this point, because then without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Austin, to start sharing his screen, and I'll stop. If that works, Austin. Thank you. Great.
Let me see. Can everyone see the screen now?
Yes, we can see. Thank you.
And still?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Because sometimes it messes up.
Oh, perfect.
Perfect. So thank you. I just want to say thanks to everyone for being here, especially to Kate and Micah and the Urban Studies Foundation for putting together this event, and to all the other panelists for being here today. I'm super, super grateful for the opportunity to speak to everybody. So I'll touch here in my presentation first on our research as a group at the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability, and at the end briefly touch on my first doctoral paper. And I'll go fast, so apologies for that. Try to stick to the time requirements. Here we go. So at the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability, what we do is we develop novel research and methods for analyzing urban environmental justice, combining participatory research, community-centered qualitative data, comprehensive spatial and quantitative tools, critical mapping, all with an overarching commitment to producing decolonial, feminist, and intersectional scholarship. And we conduct our research through 8 core lines, which range from climate and green gentrification to degrowth, nature-based solutions, urban and feminist political ecology, housing justice, health and equity. And all this seems very diverse, and we are a very diverse lab, but we have a few main research questions which drive the brunt of our work as a group, with those being, how can green cities be truly just and emancipatory for all, rather than a driver of new social and racial injustices? As well as how can we move from urban greening being embedded in politics of unequal redevelopment, competitive urbanism, and land speculation? So these are the 2 main questions which drive our research as a group at BCNUEJ. And as mentioned earlier, we explore these questions through various approaches. I'll only touch on a few due to time. One of them being qualitatively, in our new book, we've examined 21 cities in North America and Europe, where we've conducted over 600 interviews with activists, developers, governments, community groups, etc., as well as document analysis, and laid out tales of urban greening and related environmental injustices throughout each city. We furthermore developed a policy and planning toolkit, which can be used by activists, tenants, residents, community groups, or city governments, as well as engaging in critical mapping using ArcGIS story maps. But so how do we approach justice or equity as a lab, say theoretically or conceptually? Well, one main way that I can show this is we've outlined what we found to be the 10 largest drivers of injustice in the context of urban sustainability in the European Union, offering these drivers as a framework through which to analyze urban greening projects. So you can see here some drivers such as unfit institutional structures, limited citizen participation in urban planning, such as tokenistic participation, racialized or ethnically exclusionary urbanization, or weakened civil society. And while the lab focuses on North America and Europe, my doctoral project aims to read the emerging trends, contributions, and advances in urban environmental justice scholarship, as Mike has said, through Southern urbanisms, and specifically through African urbanisms. This being in an attempt to more appropriately situate urban environmental justice in sub-Saharan urban centers, something that has been critiqued elsewhere as sticking to Western conceptual frames and thus missing the most egregious injustices faced by urban residents in the region. So I'll quickly highlight my first doctoral paper, which I would like to say is forthcoming, but is still being drafted. So this paper mainly comes from the fact that Although it's rarely analyzed or called as environmental justice, unlike similar actions in North America, for example, community mobilization aimed at improving local neighborhood environmental health has long been underway throughout sub-Saharan Africa. From the Poor Men's Justice Center and the Youth Dream Center in Freetown to the Dandora Community Justice Center in Nairobi, the Network for Active Citizens in Kampala, civic groups have and continue to operationalize the language of justice in their struggles, connecting their greening efforts to further socioeconomic, individual, and communal health improvements. Now, it's important to see this absence not merely as a geographical location, but importantly as an epistemological one, which can and must be accommodated into our conceptual languages. And it's also important to not view the sub-Saharan city as exotic, to romanticize its attributes, to view it as otherworldly, but rather see it as an ordinary city, which is capable of producing urban theory, which may speak to and enhance analyses elsewhere. So from this basis, what we attempt to do with this paper is we provide a review of the trends in the critical analysis of urban socio-natures, and specifically urban green spaces in the sub-Saharan city. And we ask, how is it studied? How do people use it? How are these uses changing? And how are planners acting in relation to nature? Next, we outline what are found to be the main drivers of inequities in access to urban nature in the region. And then taken together, we then read urban environmental justice through the conceptual and theoretical advancements of the study, the critical study of urban socio-nature in the sub-Saharan city. And in this, we ask what debates within environmental justice scholarship can be enhanced from the perspective of the sub-Saharan city, but also explore the ways in which theoretical and methodological advancements in environmental justice scholarship may enrich the study of urban socio-natures in the sub-Saharan city. And we specifically highlight two things. First, how approaching urban green space as a heterogeneous infrastructural configuration, which is an emerging trend inside of the study of urban socio-natures, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but throughout the global south, answers growing calls from environmental justice scholarship for richer situated understandings and frameworks for analyzing and understanding power. And secondly, how recent advancements in the conceptualization of justice may offer complementary language and viewpoints from which to write justice into the analyses of urban socio-natures in the sub-Saharan city. And through these discussions, we're not only imagining what a sub-Saharan urban environmental justice framework could entail, but also exploring how these insights can influence future urban environmental justice studies throughout the region, as well as elsewhere around the globe, and thus taking part in the further decolonization of the field of urban environmental justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin. Great. I'm going to go straight on to Pipin. Please hold your questions if you have clarifying questions for Austin. For after the next two presentations, we'll have a chance to address those. Great. There you go, Pipin. Over to you.
Thanks, Micah. I keep getting a note that says my internet is unstable. So hopefully I can get through this.
Okay.
Here we go. Okay. I'm Pipin Anderson. I'm an urban ecologist from the University of Cape Town. I'm a botanist by training, a plant ecologist, and I've always sought out peopled landscapes. So I'm interested in how the presence of people influences landscape, and specifically plant communities and their functioning and persistence. I bring this lens directly into my urban ecology work. I actually do other stuff too. I do restoration ecology work, and nature-based solutions might finally see the marriage of my two interests. But my research questions relate to how emergent ecological communities come about. So what drives and shapes the communities we see, and how do these play out across time and space? So I'm particularly interested in environmental histories as well. And what does this mean both for the people who occupy the spaces and also for the conservation of the plant communities? And that's very pertinent in the city of Cape Town, and I'll return to that conservation issue later. The first, I guess, is to pick up on the first being my sort of interest in the people in the landscapes. This is where the kind of social justice and equity comes into my studies. The published literature gives us this kind of massive body of evidence of the importance of urban nature. And a lot of this resonates with my own research in the city of Cape Town. So we get nature for mental health and physical well-being and ecosystem service delivery across all sorts of scales. And now we get nature to sort of solve anthropogenic problems, the sort of solutions type of nature. And it's not really rocket science to see that the urban form in South African cities is still heavily informed by apartheid planning. So we get these racially divided cities, and how nature is accessed and used and experienced and how benefits play out is very varied across the South African city and matched by a very stark Gini coefficient. A lot of urban nature is accessible to the rich and less accessible to the urban poor. And access obviously ranges across, you know, the sort of financial, physical, and psychosocial barriers, again, that we're familiar with. In terms of my own research in relation to social justice and equity, it looks at how the urban form dictates access to nature and the social justice or injustices of this. In terms of sort of frontiers for my research, I just want to return here back to biodiversity conservation in the city. This is often overlooked in urban ecology literature. I think that's because the vast bulk of urban ecology literature comes from the global north, where there's less extant nature in cities. So this is a particularly strong theme in cities in the global south. And it's a very strong theme in my own research. It's really important to me to understand the ecological assembly rules that sort of underpin the continued functioning of healthy, conservation-worthy ecological communities in the cities in South Africa, and how we can use management and this understanding to inform management. And this is very tricky. We live in a fire-prone system, but this is for me, this is very interesting. I like the sort of challenge of that, people and the sort of ecological rules, and how do we manage the space collectively. With respect to how this speaks a little bit back to justice and equity, it's a slightly harder fit, but I would say perhaps the focus on securing local indigenous nature in cities could speak into indigenous identity, decolonizing practices. It speaks into global biodiversity conservation imperatives. So there's a sort of global right of citizens around the world, and potentially into sort of more than human arguments as well. So the kind of, you could speak to the justice of the persistence of species for their own sake. Another frontier would be to really develop a deeper understanding around social needs and wants in cities. And I think we need to solicit a far wider range of opinions from people around what they actually need and want from nature, and to sort of dig deeper into what underpins social values and views. And I think Austin articulated this beautifully, but to really try and build up a really large body of case material to counter global north views, and also to start developing theory from the global south as well. I think that will be a messy process. Will bring forward a lot of new imaginings and understandings, but I think that the global south cities and social views and perceptions of nature are marginalized or less understood. We definitely need more ecological insight, fire histories, ecological fallout from fragmentation, soil alteration, shifting phenologies, etc., etc. There's huge amounts of work to be done on the basic ecology. That's a definite frontier. And I would say a last frontier, I think that we miss out on the opportunity to showcase urban nature. And I think that is something we could all collectively apply our minds to. How do we demonstrate a useful, functional, delightful, variably represented urban nature to the sort of vast populace and the diverse populace that lives in our cities? I had 3 slides and I sat with 1. I didn't flick through them. But anyway, I'm done. Thanks, Micah.
Thank you, Pipin. Great. Thanks, and perfectly on time. So wonderful. And then we're going straight to Seema. Go ahead, Seema. Oh, you're still on mute and we can see your slides.
Sorry, it's late in the day, apologies. Yeah, so thank you so much for the invitation to talk in this seminar, and especially to Mike and for organizing this along with Kate. So quickly, a very quick introduction. I'm not a trained ecologist, neither am I trained in the social sciences. My training has been nearly 2 decades ago in business administration, and I worked in the corporate sector for some time. But after just 3 years in the sector, I decided to move on into the development field and sort of retrain myself, first working with conservation organizations, advocacy groups against mining projects in India, education of indigenous communities. And finally, I arrived at the urban landscape relatively recently at around 2014. And since then, the work has largely been around looking at why nature is, so I'll jump to my question, which probably I can start by answering through that. The question that we're trying to ask, and which we've been asking for the last few years, is why is nature critical for addressing the challenges of sustainability and equity? And how do we go about doing this? While they are very simple questions, but what has happened in the Indian context is that there is very little recognition about the role of nature, how they can contribute to this, because our visions in our cities are mainly borrowed from the West. Ideas of, say, Singapore, or ideas of smart cities that are catchphrases, and we have a 100 smart cities program that's running in India, which has got nothing to do with the realities of either the environment, society, or equity dimensions of the city. So our biggest challenge through our research, which we want to address, is bringing nature into focus in any conversations when we talk about cities and sustainability. We do use multiple concepts, frameworks, and methods because we are a little bit like, maybe it's because I don't have a specific disciplinary training, but we like to explore different things. And so when we talk about concepts, the peri-urban interface, for example, in Indian cities is a very complex field, and it is where a lot of environmental degradation and loss of nature is happening. So we are trying to explore how sustainability challenges can be addressed in the PUI. Similarly, when we talk about frameworks, we prefer to use something like a social ecological systems framework that is able to bring the interlinkages between society and nature. And methods, like you mentioned, Mike, in the introduction, I am very interested in history, to know about the historical evolution of cities and how they may have contributed to the challenges that we have faced today. So, for example, if there is no lake in a place that there was a lake before, why did that happen, and what are the implications? So our question is focused largely on this. So I'm going to talk about 2 aspects of research that we are right now, at least I'm right now invested in addition to some others that are in progress. One is looking at how, using the example of the East Kolkata wetlands. Kolkata is a city in India. It was the first colonial capital before it moved to Delhi, and it was set up in the 1690s, established by the British in 1690s. But one of the things they did is they developed a wetland which was seen as a malarial swarm into a productive site by diverting the waste, and that waste is used in today. The sewage is used in agriculture and fish production, and that contributes immensely to subsistence, livelihoods of hundreds of people, as well as to as a flood mitigation source, as well as food supply for the city. So there are several aspects of equity and justice dimensions, because there is this conversation around having these wetlands converted into a real estate. So we're looking both at how history, the people's interaction with the landscape is, and what can we contribute, how can we build a case as researchers, as academics, for the wetland as a nature-based solution. The other is green jobs. COVID has hit India really bad, and post-COVID, there have been several announcements by the government for urban employment guarantee schemes for the urban poor. So we are trying to see what kind of green jobs are possible. And when we talk about employment guarantee, we're talking about really the poorest of the poor in the city. So we are looking at some models that are there in cities in India. And one of them is in the state of Kerala, where urban guarantee, the jobs that are there for those who need employment, and this is a demand-based system, right? You want a job, you ask for it. At least the rural one is. So in this, can we set up for what are the vegetable gardens, for example, that can be set up in empty plots of land? What fruit gardens can be set up? What are the different areas in the city that can build and contribute towards these building resilience at a very individual level, and also for the city itself? through job creation. So we are trying to look at employment, economy, and environment. How can these green jobs contribute? And we're building all this based on the research that we are doing using the framework of urban commons in different spaces in the city. Mainly, we are housed in Bangalore, so this is one of the places we have looked at: wells, lakes, cemeteries, how people use them, how do people interact with them? Are they just aesthetic, or what are the provisioning services which don't get featured in any kind of city planning? So one of the things that we love to do while academic publications is also to bring our research out through using outreach and writing. We love to write, especially with the students in the university I teach. For example, one of the illustrated books is done by us along with students, and it has converted one of our academic papers into an illustrated story, which is Where Have All Our Gundithops Gone? It is a commons. Similarly, writing about women who do urban foraging in the city, talking to them, getting recipes, what are the kind of plants. So this is a kind of engagement. We do want to do a lot of outreach because we want to involve people in this process of integrating nature into. We also look at action research. There are many development projects that threaten the greenery of the cities, urban nature in cities. So we do provide, sometimes we do these rapid EIAs when there is a development project, which is then used by the organizations that are legally fighting it, or add data to provide one more level of information to fight these projects. So we are doing research, but research that we specifically want focused on outreach and action, which can help with some kind of aim towards some kind of a solution. And in terms of research frontiers, one thing that we are very keen on doing is, I won't say it's a frontier, but more of what our interest is look at micro level research, because India is so vast, cities are so different, but there is also massive urbanization expected. What are the different kinds of ways in which local communities have incorporated nature into finding solutions for it? So finding the history about it, the ecology about it, how do people actually find solutions to these problems which are equitable? So that's it from my side.
Thank you, Seema. Great, wonderful. Thank you all. Thank you, Austin, Pipin, and Seema. And now I'm just going to have a short moment to see if there were any clarifying questions. Again, please put those either in the chat, in the question and answer function, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. We do have a question in the chat, but it does feel like that could be a slightly bigger question for the discussion. So if there's no specific clarifying questions for the speakers right now, I feel like we can probably go straight on to the next round and maybe make up a couple minutes. So, okay, great. So then can I please invite Bonnie to go straight into the next presentation? You can see your screen. And you're still on mute.
Okay, how about that, Micah?
Perfect. Great.
Okay, fantastic.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for organizing us. It's lovely to be here. I'm Bonnie Keeler. I'm a faculty member at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And along with my colleague, Kate Derrickson, we've been working on this project called the CREATE Initiative for the last several years. And so I'm going to share a couple of insights from our work with a focus on how we've involved communities in understanding and critiquing nature as a good in an urban context. And there we go. So for those of you not familiar with the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul in Minnesota, we're up in the sort of north central part of the country. And this is a map of the two city geographies, the two counties that we're working in. So a couple of things to note here. You've got two major downtowns, Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's bisected by the Mississippi River. So you see a lot of the green, which are parks that are located along the Mississippi River. And then there's also an abundance of urban lakes in this region, which you also see lined by green. So a lot of award-winning park infrastructure in the Twin Cities, at the same time that we're also one of the cities in the United States that has the highest rates of racial disparities. Big disparities in terms of home ownership. About 75% of white families are homeowners and less than 25% of Black families are homeowners. and a highly segregated city. So one of the things that Kate and I have been working on over the past several years is really understanding the legacy of some of these racist and exclusionary housing practices on the distribution of urban benefits and burdens, and also how we think about remediating those past injustices through work that we're doing right now in the city. So this context, as you have seen in many other cities around the world, you can overlay race and income variables with a variety of different environmental benefits and burdens, whether you're talking about tree canopy cover or the amount of amenities in each park, or the location of permits for polluting industries, tree cover, estimates of particulate matter, urban heat island, et cetera. As we've seen in many other cities, those overlays suggest an unequal distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, with low income and minority communities bearing the greatest burdens, and white communities benefiting from a healthy, safe, and vibrant green urban environment. And a large question that we've had in this project is really, as the cities and their leadership have become increasingly aware of these inequities and are committed to both addressing climate change, sustainability, and addressing urban inequalities, there's been a big push to try and increase investments in these nice green amenities in cities that haven't benefited from them historically. So you can see a mock-up on the screen of one of these large investments on the banks of the Mississippi River in a predominantly African-American community, where they're going to revitalize the riverfront and put in a concert venue as well as a flagship park. The neighborhoods surrounding this are outlined in red below, and you can see that this is a predominantly non-white neighborhood where there's just big disparities in terms of property values on one side or the other of the river. So there's a lot of concern in this community about the impacts that this kind of big flagship urban green investment might have on displacement and gentrification. Through the process of this initiative, we've really centered community voices and outreach with our community partners in shaping the research agenda. And as a result of many years of engagement, we've come up with a set of research priorities that really center what we've heard from communities. And that includes concerns about displacement and affordable housing, about having meaningful citizen participation in the decisions around how we manage urban nature, questions about power and representation in the institutions that govern urban spaces, and a better understanding of how infrastructure and privilege are coupled historically and continue to be coupled today. The other focus of this work has been really questioning and reimagining the role of the research university as we engage in communities in our urban cities. And that means that we've really rethought the ethos of the project, how we relate to communities. And these are some of the best practices, including a focus on co-developing research questions with our end users, really focusing on resourcing those community partners in a variety of different ways, whether that's hosting public meetings, paying for their time, providing different kinds of knowledge products that are really useful to them. Adopting a willingness to be transformed by the questions that communities are raising, and thinking about the university as an entity that really centers community priorities and all of the ways that you have to reimagine that relationship if that's your goal. I'll just mention that we've published several papers that really focus not on the science that's coming out of this, but on the relationships and the process that we've embodied doing this work. And so here are links to some papers that have described the methods and approach that we've been using in this research. And I'll just close by mentioning a couple of the products of this initiative. So we've produced community-facing products, including this anti-green gentrification policy toolkit that focuses on specific actions that communities can advocate for if they're feeling threatened by green gentrification, including things like inclusionary zoning and affordable housing finance. And this full toolkit is available on our CREATE website. We've also engaged with graduate students throughout this project, and they have produced a number of community-facing products, including the story maps that you see on this slide, and those are also available on our website. So it's been really exciting to watch student teams come together, rethink their disciplinary perspectives and their value propositions, and work with communities to create a number of useful products. This work is continuing. We recently received funding from the National Science Foundation in the US to expand our work in the Twin Cities through this long-term social ecological research program that includes a variety of questions where we'll be moving next. So I'll just close by putting this up. We're interested in a lot of the questions that other panelists have raised, including how decisions about nature and community wealth and well-being are coupled over space and time, and how those affect social inequalities, questions about who decides what's valuable and valued about urban nature, and how we can take this work on historical context and community priorities and integrate those into our contemporary urban policy and planning. And I'll close with that. Thanks, Micah.
Thank you, Bonnie. Wonderful. We'll go straight on to Olumuyiwa, please, if you could start sharing your screen. Great, we can see your screen, but we can't hear you. There we go. Perfect, thank you.
Very good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the organizers and my co-panelists and the participants. I'm seeing a fantastic list of some familiar names from literature among the participants, and I think this is a very useful session. I'm Muyiwa from Nigeria, and my research has been focused on low-income urban communities. I've done some work in South Africa where I did my PhD, and having moved back to Nigeria, I'm continuing my work in low-income communities. I've also had opportunity to do some work in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, within low-income communities. And as you would know, there's a characteristics of cities in Africa, in developing countries, and of course, always said as the global South. And this embody inequalities. It's one of the first things that come to mind when we come to the global discourse of urban inequality. Informal settlements versus formal settlements, the slums versus the gated housing. Now, in the context of informal settlement, my work has addressed the aspects of green infrastructure, largely focusing on environmental sustainability. And I came into this through my work in informal settlements in Johannesburg. I'm sorry, I'm trying to roll the slides. Okay, good. Okay, good. So I came into this through my work in informal settlement in Johannesburg. The pictures you can see, I think they're about 10 years old. I was working in the settlement, and then I working on concern about stormwater management practices, and I see a significant practice of the contribution that home gardens make to informal settlement, to stormwater drainage and management within informal settlement. So that was one of my entry points into the notion of green infrastructure. Almost every plot had a garden, and the garden not just provided food, it provided other services. And then I asked the question, if the settlement was to be formalized, if the housing would be transformed at whatever level, what happens to the gardens? What happens to the services that the gardens provide, or what happens to the relationship of the people with the garden? So this led me to questions about the relationship between people living in informal settlement and green infrastructure, whatever constitutes green infrastructure in such a space, from the home gardens to the wetlands, to including the riparian corridors, including the streams, the blue spaces, including parks if they're available, and some other forms of green infrastructure at the dwelling scale, even if you have something like your roof, a green roof, and potted plants and all that. So how do people relate with this? What are the ecosystem services? Most of us are aware of what that means, and what are the services? So what are the problems associated with the connection to these forms of green infrastructure? So that's what I considered for my PhD. And I could understand the positive sides, the services ranging from following the Millennium Ecosystem Assessments classification, supporting services, provisioning services, regulating services, and all the like. And it's clear that as much as people in formal areas benefit from green infrastructure, people in informal settlement also benefit from green infrastructure, much closer than like what people in informal settlements enjoy. But there are also services and problems associated with it, most of them similar, but also aggravated by other conditions within informal settlements. And another aspect coming, because we're making considerations on equity here. I related the work, and I've reflected on my work so far in informal settlement within the context of equity. And of course, one of the panelists mentioned the idea of people living in informal settlements excluded from positive environmental externalities because they lack access to green spaces. There are no parks within informal settlements. They don't enjoy amenities. And even in cities where you have formal settlements, but occupied by people in the low income categories, they receive less of all this. And that embodies the distributive aspects and includes procedural aspects of these injustices. But it's also interesting to note that right within informal settlements, you have some forms of inequalities, even within informal settlements. I can spot instances of gender discrimination in one of the settlements where I worked. A sort of park established where it's only men, women cannot access that park. You find some form of semi-natural components that people can't use because they have to pay, and are thus excluded due to funds. So you find some of these pockets of inequalities even within informal settlements. But these are things that, of course, should be addressed and through concerns about equity. Now, going forward, I have been concerned about how to deliver more services in informal settlements equitably. How can we improve microclimate control? So in recent time, I've done work around vertical greening systems and to see how food production can take place, how we can cool the environment, reduce air temperature, wall temperature, indoor temperature, and outdoor temperature through vertical greening systems. We've experimented this in some cities in Lagos, in some slums in Lagos, and also in Dar es Salaam. And we're also having an iteration of different prototypes to see how we can also promote the circular economy and how we can use low-cost materials and things that could really be readily available. Of course, this also addresses concern about food security, especially the promotion of vegetables. And also I'm concerned, I've done an ongoing research about how green infrastructure can contribute to health promotion. So what green infrastructure do we have? How does it contribute to health and otherwise? And how can we address this? And also aspects of water regulation, from your flood attenuation to the forms of water security within settlements. So these are ongoing concerns in my work in green infrastructure in informal settlements still across cities in sub-Saharan Africa. So I look forward to the discussion. I'm going to end here and see, and I'm also here to learn, to see how we can address this intra-settlement inequalities and also urban level inequalities across cities in the global south. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Adding a whole new list of issues to think about and discuss to the table. That's wonderful. And last but not least, can I hand over to Lin Jin, please? We can see your slides.
Hello, everyone. I hope the slides is visible.
Perfect.
Okay, I see them now. So thanks very much, Mike. First of all, thanks very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to join today's webinar. I need to minimize this screen, otherwise I cannot see my own slide. Okay, so my name is Lin Jin here, and currently I work as Assistant Professor of Sustainable Urbanism in the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. I have a background in urban planning, but as Mike mentioned earlier in the introduction, my research focused on the governance of urban sustainability transitions. And I explicitly look at urban sustainability innovations and initiatives such as eco-city, low carbon city, smart city, and also the recently nature-based solutions, exploring how they, whether they are driving the transformative change, and also how can we upscale them to foster a just transition. And my research mainly, it is interdisciplinary, so it actually spans across several fields: urban studies, sustainability transitions, and political ecology, etc. But throughout my work, I think environmental and social justice are to the fore. So where do I start? It didn't work. So my PhD research actually looks into the eco-development in China under this ecological civilization construction. And I conducted this political ecology study of the state-led and ecological modernization guided eco-development in China, and mainly to look at whether this has, like I mentioned, has driven the transformative change in how we develop our cities. And this research reveals the paradox of ecological destruction via ecological construction, and also the tactics that Chinese governments sometimes are using, which is green here, exploitation elsewhere. This is kind of like the using a scale perspective, and to look at, from a regional perspective, to look at the overall green strategies within the cities. And moving from here, my postdoc research, which is part of the EU Horizon 2020 Nature Vision project, actually looks into how nature-based solutions are making difference in how we govern our cities and also the urban nature. And the first study that I worked with Professor Harriet Bulkley is to conduct an analysis of 199 nature-based solutions across Europe, and to evaluate whether these nature-based solutions are contributing to urban biodiversity governance. So we produced this framework, which is look at nature-based solutions' contribution to biodiversity through how they conserve biodiversity, restoring nature, and also at the same time enable cities to thrive with nature. And by thriving, we means that how to harness the nature's contribution to people, which covers social, cultural, and also environmental benefits as well. And based on this, I have written a policy brief for the COP26 briefings of the British Academy. In this policy brief, the main argument or the main content is to first to analyze the entrenched challenges for mainstreaming nature-based solutions, which including the unequal powers, persistent silos, and considerable uncertainties. And the argument is that to promote the wider uptake of nature-based solutions and to unleash their full potential requires valuing inclusion and diversity, which underlies the concept of nature-based solutions, and also embracing uncertainty that is inherent to nature. And a recent study, which is looking at the mainstreaming of sustainable innovations like MBS, and the main argument is that the mainstreaming of this kind of sustainable innovation relies on identifying and acting on certain sets of key forms of interventions, which we term as stepping stones, which can facilitate the embeddedness and maintenance of the innovation across urban infrastructure regions. And among these stepping stones, we find cultivated community-based actions, and also from, sorry, I'm timing myself. Okay, I will be quickly wrapping up. So the ongoing and the future research will focus on the mainstreaming of nature-based solutions in China, because currently I'm back to China. And also I think there is a need to explore the pathways for activating and also upscaling nature-based solutions to contribute to a just transition in for our urban future. So I will stop here, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Lin Jin. Great, you did my job for me. Thanks. So wonderful. Thank you for all of those speed talks. We do have what seems like a quick clarifying question in the chat, and this is specifically for you, Olumuyiwa. It's about a question about the framing of ecosystem services. So Isabel Anguelowski actually wants to know if your choice of looking at the benefits of green infrastructure through the perspective or lens of ecosystem services, what informed that choice, and is the ecosystem services lens a lens that cities in Western Africa are using a lot in environmental planning decisions? If you could respond to that.
Oh, okay, thanks, Isabel. Thanks for the question. The lens of ecosystem, I choose the lens of ecosystem services for to understand the benefits of green infrastructure because of its simplicity in being able to identify and categorize the range of benefits. So I find it quite simple. Of course, I know there are other lanes, other framings to understand benefits of green infrastructure, but I choose that for its simplicity, particularly for a context where understanding of green infrastructure benefits has not been done largely in literature. But coming to West Africa, this is not commonly used. I can almost query the appropriate understanding of ecosystem services among some policymakers, among some, I wouldn't say all. So I wouldn't say it's been adequately used or it's even been incorporated into environmental planning like you identified, but I feel it's a good entry point for anyone trying to understand the benefits of green infrastructure and the charts. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And with that, I think that was probably the only question sort of at this level of clarification. So I will hand over to Kate now to take us into the bigger panel discussion. Over to you, Kate.
Well, thanks, everybody. Those were some really great and interesting talks, and a lot of different questions came up for me, and we have a couple questions in the Q&A that I'll refer to as well. But I thought maybe we could handle this by, I'll just ask a question, put it out. You can just unmute yourself and jump in. And if that gets too chaotic, we can revisit that, but I think it should be fine. I thought I'd like to hear people reflect on questions of methodology and kind of innovation in methodological approaches. It seems to me that there's this really exciting blend here of kind of traditional ecology and ecological research, and then really sophisticated political ecology and social science coming together. And so a couple folks brought up historical approaches or historical analysis as a technique or a method for kind of elevating the questions that are at the center of some of these inquiries. So I'd love it to hear people talk more about kind of what methodological approaches are exciting or especially productive in the work that you're doing. I'm going to call on you, Bonnie. Oh, go ahead.
Maybe I can just, since I have this question, I had reflected on it, and I can't find any actual methodological approach as my favorite, if I would use that word. But I think in trying to incorporate equity dimensions in the aspects of nature-based solutions in cities, I'm interested in methodologies that allow comparison, because I think for some of us in the global south and in some cities where you still have a lot of knowledge gap, we still need to understand a lot of things in order to inform the right actions and solutions necessary to break the gap. So I find methodologies that allow comparison, or in a way you can tweak methodologies to allow comparison, quite interesting. Yeah, that's my take.
I'll just follow up on Kate's invitation to talk about our work on the CREATE initiative. So we've, I have a background in more modeling and environmental economics. And so working with historians on this project was the first time that I had been exposed to the kind of archival and historical work that they do. And then working with Kate as a geographer, it's been a really interesting experience for me to play with these different methodologies and really think about what you get from doing biophysical measurements and what you get from modeling and what you get from spatial science and GIS and what you understand from archival data and what you might get from ethnographic work using semi-structured interviews or working in communities. It's for me, it's just solidified the need to have a very interdisciplinary approach to all of the work that we do, that taking any one of those lenses independently misses a huge part of the story. And for me, it's been a really profound, I think, realization of how important the historical context is in understanding how we got to where we are now. I think it's very difficult to propose interventions in that current system without having that context. So that's been, for me, a really important realization. And now, like, I want to have a historian working on everything with me. But yeah, I think, and I also think it's true that, we have vastly different access to data across the sites that we're all working with in this panel. And we're working in the Twin Cities, which has this like wealth of free available public data on the environment. And we can go back in time. And honestly, there, I don't see as much of a need to continue to deploy more sensors and collect more data. We often know a lot about the urban environment. And I think the social dimensions and the implications in the policy sphere are much harder to untangle and more urgent. But that's very different in different contexts.
Can I add my 2 cents? I think one of the great joys and dangers simultaneously of doing urban work is that one tends to get involved and tangled in very diverse kinds of methods. I have the most eclectic student compliment. People always talk about, my lab, blah, blah, blah. My lab is like a scattershot of, it's like a sweet jar that fell on the floor in terms of method. I've got students that do archival work, they do repeat photography work, they do sort of ethnographic work, they do sort of social surveys. This morning I was sourcing a protometer to look at transpiration rates from leaves. We do Landsat imagery stuff, so a very diverse set of things. But I think for an ecologist, for someone who's got a biological training, the translation of the need to understand process in ecology over time scales to the incorporation of a social dimension immediately means you have to look at history. So I think that that's a very natural step.
Can I jump in? Is that fine? Yeah, so I completely agree with what Pipin says. We also use a really chocolate jar kind of a methodology for our work because it is interesting, but also one of the things that we find, especially while doing historical work, is that history is a great hook to talk to people beyond our immediate, people who understand it. It's easy to talk to my colleagues or my peers about nature-based solutions. But how do I talk to somebody who is, say, a person living in a resident welfare association or a government official? When we connect to this idea of NPS, which is still a buzzword in one sense in India, history becomes a very useful hook to get people interested. And the other reason is, one of the things that I personally like to do is to have thick interviews with people who are living in a landscape. So if I'm talking to somebody in a wetland landscape where they're doing agriculture and fisheries using sewage, I want to know why they do this. And each time they say, each family or each interviewer has a perspective that adds a little bit more to my understanding of the landscape and my understanding of how I can explain it to somebody else. So these are two that I really rely on in addition, because I'm not trained in GIS or RS, but spatial mapping is also a fantastic tool to get people's attention. So yeah.
Can I also jump in really quick? if we still have time in this question. I think also coming from a lab which is very, very diverse, and we use a lot of different methods, we use spatial analyses, interviews, and everything. I think the one that I'm most excited about, or I think is the most important when doing research around equity and justice, is, as Sima was just saying, doing more of this participatory action or militant research, but also making sure that your methodology creates outputs that are useful for those communities who are facing injustices. So, for example, it could be critical mapping or creating things that are tangible and understandable for that community, but can also have an impact on policy and impact their futures. And I'm not exactly sure exactly what that would work on. It would change for every context, but I think that's quite important.
Thanks. That makes me think of this conversation we had when we were kicking off CREATE a bunch of years ago now with community-based partners. And one of the things that came up that I go back to all the time, and I heard a little bit of echo in this in your presentation, Austin, and some others as well, which is this notion of that a collaborator brought up of the ruts. Like, how do we get out of the ruts where kind of this investment in cities ends up being just captured by investors and elites to kind of continue to develop the city in ways that benefit them and displace our communities that have not historically had forms of investment. So how does that investment not create displacement? And that was the kind of empirical question. But then the kind of broader conceptual question is like, how can we study and think about and think with communities about investments in green infrastructure and greening cities to disrupt this pattern of kind of capture and dispossession? And that seems to me like a theoretical question, but also like in a way, like a methodological question. What kinds of questions do we need to ask and answer? And I think Bonnie referenced this as well. Like, do we actually need more sensors to determine where the environment is being degraded? Or do we need different kinds of knowledges? And so I'm wondering if that resonates with any of you in terms of the kinds of knowledges you think are important to create in order to contribute to what I think is the shared goal of the folks assembled here, which is realizing social justice, whether that's integrating nature into these conversations or integrating social justice into these conversations about nature. What are the kinds of knowledges and are there ways in which you've kind of tweaked your research projects or your approaches throughout your trajectory in response to that question?
To be honest, I think I lost sight of the exact question. It's probably just me, but are you asking around how do we engage community, or sorry,
Yeah, no, that was it was a rambly question. I guess the question, what I was trying to get at is, as you try to think about the purpose of this work. So why are we studying urban inequality, and why are we studying the role of nature or nature in relation to urban inequality? Has that why question led you to do the work differently or to think about the need for work in a different way?
Now I completely get the question, but I don't have an answer. Not immediately.
Okay, maybe I can quickly just bear my thoughts, my short reflections on this. Two things would be, from my perspective in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and working in informal settlements. So I think the concern about inequality leading to certain studies would, one concern would be to generate evidence to compel investment in green infrastructure. So in this part of the world, you still find a lot of opportunities. I would use that, frame it as opportunities for investment in green infrastructure, and I would be all in for any work that convincing as a policymaker or any other key stakeholder in investing in infrastructure. It could be generation of data or some other form of activities. So I would think that is one for me. I wouldn't say I've done that well, but I think it's one key outcome when I get to think about inequality in terms of nature-based solutions. So to compel investment, when I mean investment in quotes, I'm not just thinking in the financialized terms, but to draw attention to this context where we need to raise the bar on nature-based solution. So that's what I have to say. Yeah.
Can I quickly jump on this? I completely agree with what Olumuyiwa, sorry about my pronunciation, comment and answer, and want to reflect on what Kate mentioned, that the diverse knowledge that generated by different scholars across different fields about nature-based solutions, also about just transitions. And I just want to say that all these kinds of knowledge are necessary, especially when we consider that different audiences that different knowledges are targeting at. So during our research on identifying stepping stones or the key interventions that we think are needed or necessary for mainstreaming nature-based solutions, we found that growing practitioners' expertise is also very important, because normally when people do recognize that nature-based solutions have loads of benefits, the practical question is, how can we do that? So this kind of knowledge generated from, for example, project or demonstration projects, or generated by experts from different fields, engineering, ecology, biology, geography, or even history, economy. These are all methods to build up a successful case for nature-based solutions, not only to convince the policymakers, but also to identify possible financier, and also to convince the local community that there's something that we can do and to build up the urban nature. I'm not sure that answered the question. It's just a reflection on what you are commenting about the diverse knowledge generated.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So we've got a couple of questions from attendees. One from Jeff, who asks, are there any examples of green infrastructure projects that are reducing gray infrastructure costs for the municipality, addressing planning lacks within the community, and at the same time uplifting the community both through employment and business training? So the idea of linking the green economy with the provision of services. I think this is a question about,
okay. Go
ahead, yeah.
Maybe I can go first because I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer because it's a loaded question. Well, maybe it's happening, but looking at my context here, my immediate environment, I can see an example. Maybe this principles of reducing gray costs of gray infrastructure to municipalities, maybe it's happening, and even the municipality does not even know itself. So I actually don't have an answer. I can't recall any specific example. Maybe others from other regions might have some examples at hand. I need to know about this. And, yeah,
I would agree with that. I think that there's a lot of unrecorded incidental gray infrastructure sort of hybrid encounters. So the previous question that sits above this one in that block says, what's the global north-south difference with respect to nature-based solutions? And I think that that is a major difference, is that in the global south, very often nature-based solutions can be a sort of augmentation to physical hard service infrastructure, or filling a gap around infrastructure. And I think, yeah, so in the face of kind of fiscal constraints and the inability to put up, you know, flood retention walls, etc., you know, green infrastructure is definitely serving a purpose. Where it actually gets actively put in place, you know, we have dune stabilization schemes. South Africa's got lots of working for programs, sort of public works programs. So there are things going on, but I think the question, as specifically as it's phrased, I'm not sure that I can provide a precise case to answer.
I was mentioning the East Kolkata wetlands, which is a wetland area of around 12,500 hectares. It's a protected Ramsar site as well. That is actually doing the entire sewage treatment for the city of Calcutta, of 14.9 million people, and the city does not have a sewage treatment plant. So literally, but this is not recognized by the government. So it's one of those unrecorded things. This is a huge service that the wetland is providing. There is no cost for sewage treatment. It provides livelihoods. It is supporting food security, and it's a Ramsar ecologically protected site. But again, like the others were saying, it's not recognized as a service that is being provided. If you ask anybody, they'll say, okay, the city does not have STPs, we need STPs, without realizing that that work is already being done by the wetland. So yeah, that's one huge example that is there we have.
Can I jump in really quick before we move on? I think I will just echo what everyone has been saying, that I think there are these infrastructures that are already existing. And for me in my work, I view infrastructure outside of, you know, either the wetland or the buildings or anything, but also by the people that are doing these things in the neighborhoods. And for example, if you look in Nairobi, in Dandora or Mathare, in a lot of the informal neighborhoods in the Northeast, there's a lot of community groups which are creating green spaces themselves, renovating these areas and reinvigorating these spaces and providing not only employment opportunities for youth, but also providing spaces for young kids to go to, spaces for community events. And so I think that's the big thing, that maybe these things are already occurring, but they're just not recognized as such.
Thanks, everyone. I have a kind of piggyback question off that that's also in the chat, a version of kind of something else that's in the chat, which is there a way in which thinking with kind of Southern urbanism can bring to the fore sets of concerns or approaches or analytical tools that a kind of conversation that's been kind of global North centric maybe can learn from? If that question made sense.
Yeah, I guess I could jump back in really quick if everyone doesn't mind. I think definitely based on what I was saying before, I mean, if we look at these spaces that communities are creating in their neighborhoods, especially in informal settlements, just like the photo was shown of the garden in informal settlement, I mean, these are key vital infrastructures in these neighborhoods. And if increasingly so, as I was saying in my presentation, the literature is seeing these as infrastructures that are formal, I guess if we use this formal informal dichotomy, and viewing them as vital. And I think if we look at, for example, in Barcelona just a few weeks ago, there's a community garden in Poble Sec, which was torn down because it was viewed as, you know, not profit making. There was going to potentially be a building put there. But if we see that as something that's vital to the neighborhood, something that's so important, that provides food, that provides shelter, that provides community space, then I think that's something that we can learn from global South cities, just the manner in which we view these different infrastructures.
So sort of like creating like a graying the dichotomy between formal, informal, or rethinking kind of what infrastructure is that what, I don't want to badly summarize what you're saying, but it's more like a follow-up.
That's definitely what I'm saying. I think seeing through this idea of formal and informal is problematic in its own right, because even if we say in Western cities that we have formal neighborhoods and these things, I mean, even in Barcelona, I could walk 10 minutes away from here and find what would be considered an informal neighborhood. And so I think that cutting that dichotomy is important. in terms of how we view these infrastructures.
Mm-hmm.
I could also be wrong.
No,
I mean, I think one of the other things that we've talked about in the Twin Cities is how there are, this is a very different definition of formal and informal, but how many channels for advocacy there are that are outside of what you would consider the traditional planning board or the structures and institutions that we think of as managing the city and managing green space. And we've, in some of our archival work, have uncovered how influential some particular actors are in their advocacy for improving investments in their particular neighborhood that's going to increase maybe real estate investments that they've advocated for, or how the capacity and power of white, well-resourced neighborhoods are when they leverage their voice and try and advocate for more resources in their neighborhoods. So just understand, and we have some colleagues who are doing coding of ordinances and city documents that really identify how powerful those voices can be in shaping the urban space that operate completely outside sometimes what we think of as, the traditional zoning or urban planning domains that are technocratic and done by experts in positions of institutional power.
So Kate, you asked specifically about analytical tools. So I think it's, to speak to sort of the relevance of pursuing or kind of forging or using a Southern urbanism lens or kind of fostering sort of growing a knowledge base from the South is one thing, but that isn't what you asked. That would be an easier question. But this notion of analytical tools, I think is really fascinating. I think it's really interesting. And then I think we don't know. I think that's the beauty. I think that's how bad the deficit is. I think we don't know yet because we have so much work to do. I think there's a lot of, not only do we need more work from the sort of global South cities, but until we really start doing that and being really productive in that space, we won't get a sense of what novel analytic opportunities or tools may be really useful in that space. I mean, I think a few things to touch on there might be significantly different fiscal considerations. So we often find ourselves very financially constrained. So we're often triangulating sort of narrative work with a little bit of patchy sort of water chemistry data and maybe some archival stuff. So I think more triangulation and more pulling in of a diversity of analytical data sort of opportunities to match kind of sometimes rather sort of depauperate data sets might be one of the learnings. It's rather a sad one, but it's useful as well. It makes people get quite creative. Yeah, and then I think, a lot of acknowledging that things are done very differently. So people who go in and try and unpack sort of planning histories, need to adopt methods that don't involve rolling out maps on desks because maps have gone. So it's being a little bit more dexterous, a little bit more willing to kind of try different things and be open to new ideas. But I think that we don't really know yet the answer to your question because we have a lot of work to do.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really interesting. So a follow-up would be, what's for everyone, kind of what are like dream future projects? What are you dying to know? I mean, what do you want someone else to do, but because you don't have the capacity, or what's an urgent and exciting research direction here? Give everybody a dissertation topic.
I think we don't know, following on what Pipin said, we have such vastly different contexts that we're representing in this conversation and so many levels of urgency across the North and across the South. And we have very little, we have this tension between interesting academic and theoretical questions, as well as I think what Jeff is putting in the chat, which is like very practical. Right now, I need to make decisions and have limited information and time and capacity, and I'm like trying to do the right thing. So that's a real tension. And then we also don't know what insights we're developing from our own work that are context specific and which ones are generalizable. And something that Kate and I have talked about at length is how could we develop this sort of typology of cities in a way that allows us to derive the potential impacts of some of these kinds of interventions, like gentrification. How do we know when we put in big investments in climate resilient planning or flood mitigation or urban green infrastructure? In what cities are those likely to lead to displacement and gentrification? In which cities or contexts could that be a real benefit to communities? And so building out a sort of typology and best practices that planners and decision makers can implement right now, given the urgency of these challenges. I don't think we're there yet, but we could really use some synthetic work that would help identify those opportunities and best practices.
I'll give you a curveball. If I was going to do my PhD again, which I think we all fantasize about, those that are through, Austin, you still have to sort yourself out. I think it would be really fun to explore very sort of proactive decolonizing practices through urban ecology. So looking at tackling sort of green in the city in a manner that actively reconstructs the sort of, or sort of takes down historical practices around urban greening. I think that would be really fun, but it doesn't speak to all the crises that Bonnie alludes to. But, you know, I mean, it is a crisis of a sort. I'm not making light of it, but it doesn't have the immediacy of, you know, flooding and hunger, etc. But I think that would be, a really useful project.
I think it's really interesting to juxtapose that like historical analysis and the kind of the crisis and the immediacy, because in our work, I think at CREATE and some of the conversations that we've been part of, more with the kind of conservation and environmental kind of research community, there is this sense of urgency that sometimes suggests like, well, these justice dimensions we don't have time to handle those. They have to wait, or they're second order concerns. And the urgency that we're facing is so immediate that if we mire ourselves in these kind of questions about what will happen to these groups of people, we're just going to miss our window of kind of urgent action. And so that it has been, I'm simplifying the framework, but it does feel like this tension between the urgency of the ecological crisis can be in tension with the urgency of the social justice dimensions. And in another kind of context, someone mentioned that urgency is actually a kind of tool of white supremacy, that when you sort of function as an organization or as an institution or as a movement with a sense of urgency, that what you end up doing is kind of like reinforcing existing power dynamics. And so that's been sort of undergirding some of the work, I think, in ways that we've been thinking at CREATE, which is how do we simultaneously address the urgency of these environmental problems, not just like in an abstract way, but for like communities that are flooding like on the regular, while also recognizing that urgent and status quo solutions that don't seek to disrupt these kind of patterns of dispossession are going to just further entrench these things that are leading to these outcomes. And I feel like that conversation is exciting and interesting and kind of happening, but maybe to your point, Pipin, there's a lot of work yet to do. And the last thing I'll say is, like, you know, one thing we found at CREATE is when we show people this map of racially restrictive covenants, which mean that, you know, in the United States, there was a tool of racialized exclusion in neighborhoods. And when we show that to people who have been doing urban ecological work, they have this like instantaneous kind of aha moment of like, oh, wait a minute, like I recognize this pattern. And so that seems to me to be an exciting dimension that helps that urgency question, where it brings, you can do this historical work and help the folks who have this immediate sense of urgency appreciate the tight connection between those two things. So that's what I think is the kind of exciting future, exciting future dimension here. Answer my own question. Any concluding thoughts? Anything that any panelists want to ask other panelists, or things that we haven't brought up yet that you want to close on? Give everybody an opportunity to say a couple things if you'd like to add something we haven't talked about yet. Micah, anything that came up for you that you want to add?
Sure, I'll say something, but Olumuyiwa, you were going to say something?
Yes, just for you, I'm just glancing through my notes and see anything I left untouched or some ideas that popped up. And I just want to say, I'm not saying as questions, I'm not saying as answers, but I think it's maybe something to consider, the complexity of equity, or maybe we want to call it equality, in terms of nature-based solutions, because, you know, this relates to nature, and nature in itself is not equal. So you might want to map and see everywhere green, but by nature, that is really not possible, or maybe that's not the best way to go. So maybe that consciousness is necessary. It's at times a complexity. It's at times something one needs to be conscious of, and then to find the trade-offs and all that. But of course, I am not disagreeing with equity in nature-based solution. And then the other point I seem not to have touched from my notes is the need to upscale. We have some small-scale piecemeal good examples, particularly coming to informal settlements across developing countries, but they seem to, it's most times difficult for them to move to scale. It remains an unanswered question, but I think it's something I want to say. Maybe we'll get there sometime. Yeah, these are just the 2 points I want to reflect. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that is a lot of unanswered questions, clearly. I also have quite a few, and especially one of the points you just raised around sort of, the way I read into what you were just saying is my mind immediately goes to the question around like urban form and some of the sort of narratives that are around what future cities are going to look like, you know, the smart city, the sponge city, the green city, the compact city, the 15-minute city, all these things that people are putting out. Like, what does that mean for how we think about nature in cities and equity? And I mean, maybe that I was opening a whole nother can of worms, but I mean, it's all linked to what was just said, and really interesting questions that remain to be addressed and challenged. And because we're running out of time, I have 1 minute left, just to very quickly share my screen and show you the next steps for this initiative. It's really about taking these conversations forward and having these sort of cross-sectoral, interdisciplinary, cross-scale, cross-context questions in more detail. Just a word, I think that was also mentioned in the chat, we will make the recording available at this website, so please keep an eye out for that. And we are going to then, over the next few months, work towards actually an in-person workshop in Cape Town to work more towards the special issue in urban studies, to kind of synthesize across some of these insights and these cases that have been mentioned today, and hopefully come up with a really nice special issue that captures some of these interesting questions and complexities that we've only just begun to surface in this 1.5 hour webinar. And if you have any questions, if you are working yourself on some of these interesting kind of topics and questions and want to get in touch, I've put mine and Kate's email addresses and Twitter profiles there. Please feel free. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, I just want to say a quick thank you, not just to the audience for joining us today and asking some really cool questions, but also especially to all of our wonderful speakers for making the time, some very late at night, some very early in the morning. And also thank you to Kate for co-hosting this webinar with me. And with that, thank you everyone and goodbye.